I'll be talking about why we should legalize drugs in the United States. Not decriminalize it like we've seen happen in Oregon, but legalize. I know this sounds radical to some of you, especially those of you hearing this for the first time, but hear me out. We really need more awareness around this issue, so I'll go in depth as to why I think drug legalization is a reasonable policy and why it would benefit society more than our current system does. But first, I'd like to go over why drug prohibition is such a terrible policy. Drugs have been illegal in the United States for decades now. And what have we seen? We've seen the US boom into the largest prison state in the world, where nearly half of all federal prisoners are locked up for drug-related offenses. We've seen the US become a police state where drug arrests make up most arrests. And we're seeing drug overdose rates skyrocket each year, and it's surpassing the overdose rates of countries where drug use is legal. We've seen more racial inequality because while drugs are used at an equal rate among all the races and classes of people, poor or rich, Black people make up 60% of all those incarcerated for drug offenses, while Latinos make up 30%. And for my more libertarian friends, drug prohibition has allowed government to intrude on people's lives in more ways than we should be comfortable with. Law enforcement and courts have the right to imprison you, confiscate your home, your car, your property, invade your house via SWAT raid, and all because they might suspect you of drug-related activities. Prohibition has normalized discrimination against those who use drugs, even if the drug user has no other criminal record besides having drugs. Many who get caught with drugs lose their jobs, get rejected from welfare, employment, housing. The system can separate families and take your kids away. They do all this. They destroy a user's ability to build a future for themselves, and all in the name of helping them. This even happens to people who have no drug abuse problem or history of harming others. Just casual users whose lives are ruined by unreasonable policies. And for those who struggle with addiction, seeking help isn't even an option, because if they try, they're forced to endure all kinds of punishment and humiliation. And this is just how prohibition looks like from inside our country. Internationally, the effects are worse. The drug war is the reason why we've seen large criminal organizations spring up around the world, like the cartels. Organizations that have become so big that they rival small governments in developing nations. Organizations who altogether are responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands, maybe at this point even millions of people. The drug market is a big market, and because it can only exist in the black market, criminal organizations use it as its main source of income, which they use to fund their other activities. The violence they create has led to mass migrations of people fleeing that violence. And that's why we're seeing so many refugees come from Central America. Whenever we crack down on these organizations, their operations don't suddenly cease to exist. It just moves somewhere else. They bring the violence with them. The more we crack down on drugs, the more the violence spreads. And this violence is probably one of the greatest costs of the drug war. Besides, we're wasting our time and money trying to eliminate drugs. If banning drugs was meant to help society, it's difficult to see how. We've figured out all these clever ways to raid, bust, punish, and bully drug users, but the drugs never go away. We keep throwing money at police, prisons, these religious-run rehabs, and drug use never drops or goes away. If anything, more people do drugs now than before. We all know what a joke alcohol prohibition was, but Jesus Christ. Have we looked at what a failure the drug wars turned out to be? 35 million Americans are regular drug users. That equals 10% of the population. And by regular, I mean people who use narcotics at least once a month. If you want to look at how many Americans try drugs in their lifetime, though, the number's way higher than 10%. And as I mentioned earlier, drugs are the main reason why Americans get arrested. About 1.5 million Americans get arrested each year, which equals a drug arrest every 25 seconds. 86% of those arrests are for possession charges. Mostly people carrying around personal amounts of a drug, usually a gram or less. And for those of you who don't know, a gram is about the weight of a sugar packet, less than a sugar packet actually. And as for the other 14%, those arrests are drug traffickers, most of which, 9 out of 10, are actually low-level dealers who look like regular people, like you or me. They're people who are usually selling from their stash, probably to a friend, or they are a drug dealer but make barely enough to pay rent. Yet when we sentence them to prison, we do it with the same severity designed for kingpins, a low-level drug dealer who doesn't even know where the drugs come from and have no direct connection to crime orgs, are the ones serving sometimes the longest sentences for drug trafficking. All this has done nothing to stop the drug trade or the violence associated with it. But politicians and the criminal justice system don't care, and they keep doing this because it makes them look good, so we just keep wasting money doing this. Besides the arrests they make, they aren't even fairly enforced because they target some groups more than others. Black and Latinos make up most arrests, 2/3 of all arrests, even though drugs are used at an equal rate across all races. Black people are up to 8 times more likely to get arrested for drugs than white people. Not to mention, they make up 80% of all the arrests for crack cocaine, even though most crack users are white. And between 1991 to 2001, 9 times as many black people went to prison for crack than white people. So in theory, the drug war was supposed to be a war about drugs. But when you judge it by its results, the war on drugs has been a war on minorities and poor people. If the war on drugs is really about drugs, wouldn't we see higher rates of white people or rich people going to prison? Don't you think it's fishy that people with private planes don't have to go through TSA? Anyway, if banning drugs was supposed to lead to less drug use and prevent overdoses, why have the numbers gone up instead of down? Isn't it ironic that drug overdose rates keep skyrocketing each year even though drugs are illegal? Year after year, the US keeps breaking its own record. In 2015, we had about 50,000 drug overdose deaths, and that's how many people died in Vietnam. But this all happened in 1 year. Know what the overdose rate was in 2021? Last year? 107,000. We're now losing twice as many people to overdoses as we lost to Vietnam, and all in a year. Our overdoses have doubled in just 6 years. Now how much longer will it be before that number doubles? If we keep doing things this way, it can happen. So what's happening here? Why are so many people dying? What's happening is street drugs keep getting contaminated with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that can be 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. It's easier to produce than other opiates because you don't need to grow it in fields. You can just make it in a lab. And it's cheaper too. Cheaper than other drugs. So when illicit drug suppliers want to make more money by selling you less real drug and mixing in other additives, they'll lace that shit with things like fentanyl to increase the potency and sell you less of the drug you want. The problem is, fentanyl is already so strong that a few particles too much can be enough to kill you. Like I said, 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. So when people buy drugs like coke, meth, heroin, ecstasy, or even counterfeit pills, they think they're buying one drug, but it's actually mixed with something else. And that makes it dangerous because fentanyl is not something you want to fuck around with or take by accident. 60% of drug overdoses in 2020 were fentanyl related, which means most drug overdose deaths are due to contaminated drugs. What we're witnessing is a mass poisoning happening because the drug market is severely unregulated. We saw the same thing happen with alcohol during Prohibition. More people died of alcohol poisoning in the second half of Prohibition because more and more of the liquor supply kept getting contaminated with methanol. And when people then realized there was nothing they could do to stop that, to stop people from drinking, they had enough common sense to re-legalize liquor and regulate it so they can ensure its quality. We have to understand drugs are never going away, in the same way liquor never went away. So allowing these drug markets to stay unregulated and stay illegal creates more harm than regulating it ever would. Could you imagine how many lives could have been saved if none of the drug supply was laced with fentanyl these days? If the FDA could approve drugs and ensure its purity, it could prevent up to 60% of the overdoses that we're seeing today. Legalizing drugs and regulating it gives us more leverage over how drugs are used and safety. It sets forth a drug etiquette that more people are willing to follow as long as they have access to their preferred drug. For example, alcohol is legal, but that doesn't mean you're allowed to drink it anytime, anywhere. You can't drink while working and operating machinery. You have to do it at a designated time and place. The bar, at home. For cigarettes, you're allowed to smoke, but only outdoors and away from entrances. Policies like this have proven more effective in increasing safety and mitigating drug use than outright banning it ever has. Instead of wasting so much time and resources on arresting people, people should spend more time on minimizing the harm drugs can create for themselves and others. Harm reduction has proven to work. More people are more responsible than you think, and they're willing to cooperate as long as they're informed about the risks. I know this sounds hard to believe to some of you, But another example of effective harm reduction in recent years has been the reduction of drinking and driving and over-drinking. Alcohol is the most popular hard drug in the world. Yet in the US, there are only 2,000 alcohol poisonings each year, while 10,000 people die because of alcohol-related car accidents. For a nation of 120 million drinkers, these statistics are pretty impressive when you compare to the 100,000 overdoses happening because of narcotics. And narcotics aren't nearly as popular as alcohol. Drinkers are aware of how much alcohol is too much. 1 beer equals 1 shot equals 1 glass of wine. People appoint designated drivers and collect keys at parties. Everyone looks after each other. Simple things like this go a great way in preventing harm. Could you imagine if we put that same energy into other drugs? Imagine promoting a culture where drug use is fine in certain spaces, places where people can monitor you and make sure you don't do something dangerous. Imagine opium sites where attendants can keep an eye on you and know how to help you in case you overdose. Imagine buddy systems where everyone carries naloxone. Imagine educating people on what the right amount of coke or heroin is so they know how much is a scientifically standard amount and how much is too much. Imagine labels. So many drug users out there are so uninformed about what they're using. Could you imagine what the world would be like if none of the food we bought had FDA approval? No warning labels, no expiration dates, no nutrition facts, no inspections, nothing. There could be a salmonella outbreak or tainted food or gluten in peanuts, which some people are severely allergic to. And manufacturers wouldn't have to tell you shit. And this is the world that drug users are currently living in. There's no way for them to know what they're taking. They have to figure things out on their own, and this leads to dire consequences. Our country needs a different approach to the drug problem because this whole don't do drugs, let's arrest more people bullshit isn't working and never will. China banning opium didn't stop opium during the Opium Wars. Prohibition didn't stop drinking in the 1920s. Banning drugs didn't stop drugs in the 20th century, and it sure as hell won't in the 21st century. Drugs are here to stay. Want to know how big the illegal drug industry is? In the US, it's $120 to $150 billion a year. That rivals the alcohol industry. And to put it further in perspective, want to know how big the movie industry is? Less than $50 billion in the US and $100 billion worldwide. Americans spend more on illegal drugs than the whole world spends watching movies. So do you realize how ridiculous it is that we don't recognize this as a legitimate market? The fact that people think they can eradicate drug use shows you how delusional the anti-drug ideology is. Stopping drugs is as delusional as trying to stop everyone from watching movies. Worldwide, the drug industry is estimated at $400 billion. Yet most countries seem to think the US approach is right, because we act like we know what we're doing, and so they copy us, and all our bullshit policies. And the Philippines has taken it to a whole nother level, but I won't get into that here. Want to know which countries aren't copying the US though? Spain and Portugal. Drugs there are decriminalized for the most part, and decriminalization hasn't led to any doomsday prophecies that anti-drug fanatics usually shout out about how everyone's going to turn into a zombie or an addict. If anything, decriminalization has improved things in both countries. In Spain and Portugal, fewer teenagers are doing drugs now than during Prohibition. Probably because drugs lose a lot of their glamour when they aren't considered forbidden fruit. There's also way less overdoses per capita. In 2017, Portugal experienced just 6 overdose deaths per million people, while Spain experienced 15 deaths per million. Want to know what the US was? We had 185 drug overdose deaths per million in 2017, and the very next year it spiked to 314 per million, making our overdose rate 50 times higher than Portugal's. Drugs are allowed in their country, not in ours. Portugal's overdose death rate is 5 times lower than the rest of Europe. Ours is 50 times higher than theirs. Do you see what's happening here? What's happening is Portugal and Spain accept the fact that drugs will always be a part of everyday society. There's no way to eliminate it, so their approach is different. They aren't arresting and trying to stop and hurt drug users. They're providing treatment and promoting safety, harm reduction. So what are some of the things Spain and Portugal do to promote safety? One is they offer injection sites, places where users can shoot up heroin or other drugs in front of medical staff. So if they overdose, they're there to save them. Not only that, but they also offer them clean needles, which prevents infections that are caused by needle sharing or reusing old needles. I know a lot of people find this atrocious because injection sites practically enable drug use, but hear this out. Before Portugal had injection sites in 1999, there were 369 overdose deaths and 104 HIV infections per million people that year. 369 and 104 per million. 20 years later, after introducing injection sites, there were 6 overdose deaths and 1.5 new HIV infections per million. A tremendous improvement. And if my math is right, that's a 95% improvement. For comparison, in 2019, the United States has had 216 overdoses and 126 HIV infections per million, which makes us as bad as Portugal was 20 years ago, before they decriminalized drugs. Another service they do are health screenings. Since drugs aren't 100% legal there, rather than arresting people, they give them a ticket. But if people want to waive the ticket, they can participate in a health screening, where a lawyer, a judge, and a doctor screen them and determine whether they have a drug abuse problem or not. If they do, they can refer them to an addiction treatment program. But if they choose not to attend it, then they have to pay the fine. And another thing they offer at some places are drug purity checks. A process where you submit a sample of whatever drug you have, they test it, then they give you the results and tell you what's in it. Basically, they tell you the purity of the drug, and then you decide if you still want to take it or not. And who would have thought that allowing drug users to test the safety of their drugs would be such an effective system? As it turns out, testing drugs reduces overdoses. So what does that tell us? It tells us that drug users actually want to be careful and will choose to if they're given the option. Apparently, drug users practice their own version of self-care. It's almost like everything we've come to believe about drug users is wrong, and they're actually more responsible than we've given them credit for. Believe me, I've been doing harm reduction in Skid Row for a little while now, and you'd be impressed with how much houseless addicts actually care. Decriminalization provides better, more positive outcomes than prohibition, across the board. Canada has been trying harm reduction for a while now, and they're seeing similar results to Portugal. I gotta say though, even though decriminalization works, I still take issue with it. I think we can do better. Under decriminalization, drugs aren't exactly legal, and a lot of things are still in limbo. Consuming drugs or possession might not land you in prison, but if the police feel like it, they can still ticket you, which we all know will hurt poor people more than middle class or rich people, and it'll reproduce the same disparities we're seeing today with minorities. Besides, pressuring people to attend drug screenings to get out of a ticket also seems like an inconvenience to those who can't afford to go. Under decriminalization, drug dealers can still go to prison because sale of drugs is still illegal, and the country still wastes resources on police to crack down on drug trafficking, which means there's still a black market running amok, where criminal orgs are still controlling the supply of drugs and make all their money off of it. Decriminalization is a step in the right direction, but it still clings on to a lot of drug war dogma. Legalization would take one of the most lucrative markets in the world away from criminal organizations. If we could divert customers away from them and lead them towards licensed shops run by law-abiding citizens, where products are safe and inspected, then we can charge taxes that we can use to fund drug treatment and other services. With legalization, we would also see less overdoses, less violence, waste less resources on law enforcement, prison, and courts, and find more humane, cost-efficient ways to deal with the drug problem. It costs the same amount to put 7 people in treatment as it does to put 1 person in prison, and it's treatment that's proven to work and rehabilitate a person, not prison. Not to mention, the Cato Institute estimates drug taxes would generate $46 billion in revenue annually, after expenses. Aside from that, legalization would finally grant experts the freedom to research drugs without strict government approval. They could develop better cures for depression, which they're discovering could be done with LSD, shrooms, and MDMA. Or they might develop new drugs. We might see the development of newer, safer, less addictive version of drugs based off the ones that we already know. Imagine a milder form of opiate that you can't overdose from. And even if they can't invent safer drugs, another technique that's proven to work, better than prohibition, is hiking taxes on the drugs that are most problematic. Taxes are the reason why tobacco use has gone way down in recent years. Higher taxes on liquor results in less alcohol consumption. So higher taxes would surely deter cocaine, heroin, and meth use without having to ban any of them, and without punishing individuals who choose to use them. For doomsayers who say the United States will become a nation of drug addicts and zombies if we legalize drugs, that's pure sensationalism. Portugal and Spain have proven that's not true. so long as you provide treatment and practice harm reduction. When alcohol prohibition was repealed in 1933, a year when the world was still shit deep in a depression, people expected alcohol to flood the streets of America. They expected things to go to shit and for there to be chaos everywhere. As it turned out, things remained pretty peaceful. Legalization didn't result in widespread alcoholism. If anything, drinking rates rebounded to where they were before Prohibition, and have remained more or less the same ever since. Drug addiction isn't as pervasive as we've been led to believe. Cocaine and heroin don't automatically turn you into an addict just because you try it once. Addiction is far more complicated of an issue, and I'll make a video about that, but addiction rates for these drugs are less than you think. On average, just 10 to 20% of drug users ever become an addict to drugs, which is the same rate for alcohol. In other words, 80 to 90% of drug users never experience drug dependency. For comparison, divorce rates in this country are 50% while college dropout rates are 20%. So you're more likely to end up in a divorce if you get married, or drop out of college if you go to college, than you are of becoming a drug addict if you try drugs. These are good numbers we're dealing with. And if we finally get rid of the religious-run 12-step programs like AA, which don't even qualify as professional therapy, by the way, and replace them with more evidence-based drug treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy or meds like methadone or Suboxone, then recovery rates are only going to get better. More and more we're finding out most of the things we learned about drugs are wrong, and that our drug policies are heavily misguided, which I believe a lot of you already suspected before watching this. The drug war has failed. It's failed to meet its goals. It has done little to nothing to fix the drug problem. It's destroyed communities, bloated up police departments, courts, and prisons, led to the expansion of criminal organizations, and hurts us civilians in more ways than we've recognized, from SWAT raids to separation of families to employment discrimination, or being unable to help someone struggling with addiction because doing so could hurt them. From Breonna Taylor, who was killed pointlessly by law enforcement because her boyfriend sold drugs, to George Floyd, whose murder they try to justify because they said he had a little meth in his system and that's what caused him to die. To my coworker who suffers crippling student loan debt because they caught him with weed and revoked his scholarship. To all the immigrants who are coming here because they're fleeing the violence in their countries that are a byproduct of our drug policies. The drug war has affected everybody's lives in more ways than we've acknowledged. Yet, we keep fighting it even though we lost. Drugs won the drug war. It's time to clean out shop and embrace new policies that respect human rights and promote positive change. It's time to recognize drugs as a health issue too, and not a criminal one. As James Baldwin once put it, if you want to get to the heart of the dope problem, legalize it. If we lift prohibition instead of looking at all drug use as a problem, we can finally start focusing on the problems within it that actually matter and address them appropriately, with care.